Two cops laughed in the face of a black female judge in her own courtroom. But what she did next, it didn't just silence the room, it set the internet on fire. Stick around, because this isn't just a courtroom drama. This is a statement. Welcome to BrainFuel, where real stories spark real thought. Here, we bring you the bold, the untold, and the moments that matter. If you believe in truth, justice, and voices that fight back, you're out of line, ma'am. The words echoed like gunfire in a silent courtroom. Every head turned, every eye widened. For a second, you could hear nothing, not even the air conditioner hum, just the raw tension hanging between the speaker and the bench. It was 8:45 a.m. at the Franklin County Courthouse, a place known more for traffic tickets and civil cases than viral moments. The courtroom was half full, attorneys setting up, the clerk organizing dockets, a few families sitting quietly waiting for their turn. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. Until she walked in. Judge Keisha Monroe, wearing her signature black robe with her hair in tight curls and a silver brooch on her collar, stepped through the side door and up to the bench. She carried herself like someone who had walked through fire and come out unburned, graceful, grounded, and absolutely commanding. She didn't need to raise her voice to get attention. Her presence alone silenced the room. At just 42, she had become the youngest and only black female judge in the county's history. But don't mistake her kindness for weakness. She had a reputation for giving fair rulings, sharp opinions, and not tolerating nonsense. The courtroom rose as she entered, and then sat when she did. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Keisha Monroe presiding. First case on the docket. The People versus Marcus Hill, a 17-year-old black teen arrested the previous night on suspicion of resisting arrest and trespassing. Marcus shuffled into the courtroom, hands cuffed, escorted by two white officers, Sergeant Mike Daniels and Officer Brian Clark. The moment they entered, Judge Monroe noticed something off. Marcus had a swollen lip, bruises up his arm, a bandage over his right eyebrow. Her eyes narrowed. She looked down at the police report. Something didn't add up. The arrest was for alleged loitering outside a closed convenience store, with no mention of violence. Yet the teen looked like he had been in a fight with a brick wall. Bring the defendant forward, she instructed. Marcus was brought up, eyes downcast. He was trembling slightly. His public defender leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Then Judge Monroe turned to the officers. Sergeant Daniels. Officer Clark. I have a question. The officers stood stiffly. Who authorized the use of force during this arrest? A pause. Then Daniels spoke, without making eye contact. We followed procedure, Your Honor. That's not what I asked, she replied, her tone flat but firm. Was force used? And if so, who authorized it? Clark stepped in. The suspect resisted. We responded accordingly. Judge Monroe tapped her pen twice. That was her signal, not of annoyance, but calculation. She was thinking. I read the full arrest report, she said. There's no mention of resistance. No struggle documented. No body cam footage attached. And yet this young man is visibly injured. The tension in the room started to rise. You could feel it. Hear it in the subtle shifts of people in the pews. See it in the quick glances exchanged between attorneys and the public defender. Something was happening. It was a fluid situation, Your Honor, Daniels said quickly, now getting agitated. We don't answer to you when we're doing our job on the street. And there it was. Those words, that tone, that open disrespect. You could hear a pin drop. Judge Monroe's face didn't change, but her posture shifted. She leaned slightly forward, eyes locked on the officers. She didn't have to yell. She didn't even have to raise an eyebrow. Her silence was enough to drown out everything. Then, slowly, she asked, Do you speak to every judge this way, Sergeant Daniels, or just the black ones? Boom. The courtroom rippled with silent shock. Daniels' face turned red, but he didn't apologize. He stood his ground. Clark looked nervously toward the clerk, realizing something had gone very wrong. The court stenographer kept typing, every word being etched permanently into the record. Judge Monroe continued, Let me remind you, this is a courtroom, not your patrol car, not an alley, not a locker room. You don't get to bring your attitude in here, and expect to walk away unchecked. Daniels snapped, "You're overstepping, ma'am." And that was the final straw, the moment that would end up on YouTube, the moment that would make headlines, the moment people would replay again and again in TikToks and tweets. Because in that single outburst, a decorated police officer in full uniform had called a sitting judge ma'am, shouted at her, and told her she had no authority in her own courtroom. A courtroom that she earned her way into through years of hard work, late nights, discrimination, struggle, and defiance. A courtroom that she ruled with justice, not ego. Judge Monroe slowly reached for the small button on her desk. Click. A light on the side wall blinked. "Bailiff," she said calmly, approached the bench. The bailiff, a stocky man named Jordan who had worked with her for years, walked up without question. She pointed directly at the two officers. "Please escort Sergeant Daniels and Officer Clark into holding for contempt of court." The officers froze. Daniels stuttered, "You can't." "I just did." The courtroom had turned into a pressure cooker. After Judge Monroe ordered the officers to holding, no one moved for several seconds. Not the clerk, not the stenographer, not even the public defender. It was as if everyone was waiting to see if the officers would actually comply or escalate. Sergeant Daniels, puffing up his chest, stepped forward. "You can't be serious," he barked. "You're going to throw two cops in holding? For doing our job?" Judge Monroe didn't flinch. "For doing your job? Or for shouting at a sitting judge, refusing to answer basic questions, and undermining the authority of this court?" Officer Clark raised his hands slightly, as if to calm the situation. "Your Honor, let's not make this a bigger deal than it is. We're just trying to keep the streets safe." She cut him off. "Officer Clark, you will speak only when you are addressed, and you will not gaslight this court into believing that questioning injuries on a minor is making a big deal." Her voice was still even, controlled, but it carried weight. No one doubted who had the authority in that room, and it wasn't the men in uniform. Daniels wasn't done. He turned to the bailiff who had stepped forward cautiously. "Are you really going to touch a superior officer?" he said, almost laughing. "This is harassment." Judge Monroe spoke clearly for everyone to hear. "Sergeant Daniels, I am giving you one final opportunity to respect this courtroom and comply with a lawful order. If you do not, you will face immediate consequences beyond contempt charges, including obstruction, intimidation, and potential suspension of duty." The room was frozen. Daniels looked like he wanted to explode. His hand twitched near his utility belt. His jaw clenched. He looked at the crowd, at the reporters, at the cameras, and then, perhaps realizing the entire country would soon be watching this moment, he reluctantly nodded and took a step back. "Fine," he muttered, "but this isn't over." Judge Monroe locked eyes with him. "You're right. It's not." The bailiff escorted both men out, and the door slammed behind them like thunder. The courtroom finally exhaled. Murmurs broke out. The clerk whispered to the judge, the prosecutor turned to his assistant, and even the public defender leaned over to Marcus Hill, the bruised teen, whispering something reassuring. But Judge Monroe wasn't done. She turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Hill, you have a right to remain silent, but I'd like to ask if you were treated with excessive force during your arrest." Marcus looked up slowly. His lips trembled. You could see the battle inside him. The fear, the uncertainty, the trauma of being in the back of a police car, bruised and cuffed. But he found his voice. "Yes, Your Honor," he said softly. "They slammed me into a fence. I wasn't doing anything. I didn't even know what was happening." A ripple of anger moved through the gallery. Judge Monroe nodded solemnly and turned to the court reporter. "Please enter that into the record. I am ordering an emergency review of the arrest footage, medical report, and the officer's full disciplinary history. This court will not tolerate the abuse of minors or the abuse of power." She paused. "And let be known, no one is above the law in this courtroom, not even those who wear the badge." It wasn't just a bold statement. It was a declaration of war against the silent culture of intimidation that had gone unchecked for years. In that moment, something shifted. Something bigger than just a courtroom drama. It was a reckoning. Back in the hallway, word was already spreading. A reporter outside the courtroom tweeted, "Breaking. Franklin County judge just held 2 police officers in contempt after they disrespected her in court and refused to explain injuries to a teen suspect. Tensions boiling. Hashtag Judge Monroe. That tweet alone got over 30,000 likes in the first hour. Inside the courthouse, people started looking at Judge Monroe differently. Not because she had changed, but because the truth had come to light, a truth that many black professionals, especially women, know all too well. It wasn't just about that one moment. It was about every moment that came before it. Every time someone underestimated her. Every time she was called girl instead of judge. Every time she walked into a courtroom and had to prove she belonged. But this time, she didn't have to prove anything. She showed it. And while she remained composed, the storm outside had already begun. News vans lined up. Camera crews gathered. Social media lit up. Civil rights groups picked up the clip. Even former judges and legal scholars chimed in on live news panels. Some praised her courage. Others questioned her professionalism. But what no one could deny was that something rare had happened. A black woman in power stood up, not with anger, but with authority. Not for herself, but for justice. And she did it in front of everyone, cameras rolling, no fear in her eyes. And the disrespect? It didn't break her. It revealed them. The sound of the courtroom door, closing behind the officers, echoed like a gavel of fate. For a moment, there was silence. Judge Keisha Monroe took a deep breath and adjusted her robe slightly. She wasn't just composing herself. She was stepping fully into the moment, not just as a judge, but as a black woman in power who had just made a decision that would ripple far beyond the 4 walls of that courtroom. She leaned forward, her voice clear, steady, and sharp. Let the record show that both Sergeant Mike Daniels and Officer Brian Clark have been removed from this courtroom for contempt, following their failure to comply with direct and lawful orders, and for exhibiting behavior unbecoming of law enforcement officials in a court of law. The court reporter's fingers danced over the keys, capturing every word. The stenographer didn't need to look up. She, like everyone else in the room, was witnessing something historic. The prosecutor looked stunned. Not angry, but caught off guard. He opened his folder as if looking for something to say, but then closed it again. What would he argue? Everything had happened right in front of him. Then Judge Monroe looked directly at Marcus Hill, the 17-year-old black teen who had just seen 2 officers dragged out of court for mistreating him. "Mr. Hill," she said, "you have rights. You have dignity. And I want you to understand something. No one, not even a police officer, is allowed to violate either of those." The boy's eyes welled up. It wasn't just relief. It was validation. For someone like Marcus, who likely grew up being told to keep your head down and stay quiet, this moment was something he never expected. Someone in power standing up for him. His mother, sitting at the back, wiped her face quietly with a tissue. She had been holding her breath since the moment her son walked in, bruised and handcuffed. Now she exhaled just a little. "We are placing this case on pause," Judge Monroe continued. "I am ordering a full review of the arrest, the body cam footage, if it even exists, and an internal investigation into the officer's conduct." Whispers swept through the courtroom gallery. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, and the cameras, discreet but very much recording, caught every second. "This isn't just about one arrest," Monroe added, now speaking to the room and the world beyond. "This is about accountability. If officers cannot conduct themselves with professionalism in front of a judge, what happens when no one's watching? What happens in a dark alley or during a traffic stop when there are no witnesses?" You could feel the impact of her words land like bricks. She was no longer just delivering a ruling. She was delivering a message, one that needed to be heard in every city, every courtroom, every precinct. The courtroom lights, the hardwood bench, the worn leather chairs, they were all part of the setting. But Judge Monroe, she had become the scene itself. The clerk handed her a manila folder, a preliminary report from Internal Affairs, requested just after the officers had been removed. She flipped it open and scanned quickly. "Sergeant Daniels has 2 prior complaints filed against him," she announced, both involving excessive force. One was dismissed due to lack of evidence. The other settled quietly out of court. Gasps echoed in the room. "Officer Clark has none on file." but both failed to activate their body cameras during the arrest. That alone is a violation of department protocol. This wasn't just about being disrespected anymore. Judge Monroe was building a case, not for show, but for justice. With every statement, she made it clear this courtroom, under her authority, was not a playground for unchecked power. I will be submitting a formal letter to the Police Oversight Committee and the District Attorney's Office by the end of today, she said. In the meantime, Mr. Hill is to be released from custody under supervision of his mother, pending further review. Marcus looked at his mother, who now wept openly in the gallery. Judge Monroe wasn't finished. This isn't about being anti-police, she said, preemptively addressing what critics would surely say within hours. It's about being pro-accountability. Law enforcement is supposed to protect and serve, not intimidate and injure, and certainly not belittle a judge doing her job. With that, she stood from the bench. Everyone rose with her, but as she gathered her files, she said one last thing, not into the microphone, but loud enough for the courtroom and those watching the footage later to hear. Power means nothing if you're afraid to use it for what's right. And then she walked out. The door shut behind her, and the courtroom, full of strangers, staff, press, and attorneys, burst into hushed murmurs. Some said they'd never seen anything like it. Others whispered that she had gone too far. But most were in awe. Judge Monroe didn't just restore order in the courtroom. She restored something far more important: the belief that the system could work if those in power had the courage to challenge it. By the time Judge Keisha Monroe stepped out of her chambers, the world outside her courtroom had already changed. She hadn't even taken off her robe when her clerk, Melissa, came rushing in, holding her phone up with wide eyes. "Judge," she said breathlessly, "you're trending." Monroe raised an eyebrow. "Trending where?" Melissa turned the phone around. There was a clip already clipped, edited, and posted by a reporter in the gallery. The caption read, "Watch. Black female judge holds 2 white cops in contempt for disrespect in her courtroom. Hashtag Judge Monroe, hashtag Justice in Action." The view count? Already over 600,000. Keisha Monroe sat down slowly in the chair beside her desk. She knew the moment was significant. But this was wildfire, out of her control, yet centered around her. Her phone, normally silent, buzzed nonstop. Mentions, messages, calls from unknown numbers. Local news, national news, a request from a morning show, 3 podcast invitations, even a DM from a well-known civil rights lawyer who simply said, "Thank you. We've been waiting for someone like you." She glanced back at Melissa. "Let's prepare a statement." "No interviews yet." Melissa nodded and rushed out. Small Blue Diamond across the country, eyes were glued to their screens. In a matter of hours, Judge Monroe's courtroom confrontation wasn't just news, it was the news. Clips of the contempt order were shared across TikTok, Twitter, YouTube Shorts, and Instagram Reels. Edits were made with dramatic music, slow-motion zooms on her face, as she said, "Do you speak to every judge this way? Or just the black ones?" One TikTok edit had over 2 million likes in under 12 hours. Influencers called her a real-life Olivia Pope. Civil rights groups called her the embodiment of modern justice. Celebrities started reposting the clip with fire emojis, praising her bravery. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Judge Monroe. Hashtag Black Women in Power. Hashtag Contempt for Corruption. Hashtag Respect the Bench. Hashtag Justice Served. Even major news anchors began discussing the moment live on air. "What we saw here wasn't just a judge enforcing order," one anchor said. "We saw a woman of color, in power, demanding the respect she's earned, and holding those in uniform accountable. That doesn't happen often. It certainly doesn't happen without backlash." And backlash did come. Small Blue Diamond, the controversy erupts. Not everyone was celebrating. Some conservative pundits accused her of disrespecting law enforcement. Police union reps began giving interviews calling her actions unprecedented and a dangerous message to officers. On talk radio, one host said, "This judge is out of control, holding officers in contempt like she's some queen on a throne. That's not justice. That's ego." But those who actually watched the full courtroom footage knew better. The facts were right there, recorded from multiple angles. She had remained composed. The officers had been openly dismissive, condescending, and aggressive. And above all, she never raised her voice, only her standard. Even as social media turned into a digital battleground of opinion, Judge Monroe stayed silent, for now. Small Blue Diamond, meanwhile, back in Franklin County. Marcus Hill, the teen at the center of the case, was released that same day into the custody of his mother, pending the review ordered by the judge. His mother, Patrice Hill, gave a quiet statement to a local reporter. "Judge Monroe saved my son's life," she said through tears. That courtroom wasn't just about rules and law. That was about truth. She saw my son. She saw the bruises. And she stood up when most people wouldn't. Marcus didn't speak to the media, but a photo of him hugging his mother on the courthouse steps, tears streaming down both their faces, became symbolic. A young black boy escaping a system designed to break him because someone in power refused to ignore the abuse. Small Blue Diamond, Judge Monroe breaks her silence. 3 days after the incident, Judge Monroe released a public video statement. It was just 2 minutes long. No background music, no production, just her, in chambers, looking directly into the camera. Here's what she said. "This past week, an incident in my courtroom has received national attention. Many have celebrated, and some have criticized. I want to be clear, this was never about politics. It was about professionalism. It was about the rule of law. As a judge, I do not hold power for my ego. I hold it to protect the principles of justice, fairness, and accountability. When those principles are threatened, even by people who wear the badge, I have a duty to act. I did not become a judge to become famous. I became a judge to make sure justice is not a luxury of the privileged, but a right of all people. That includes teenagers who come into my courtroom bruised and scared. I hope this moment sparks conversation, not about me, but about the world we live in, and how we can make it better, together." The video racked up 7 million views within 48 hours. Even her critics had to admit the delivery was flawless. Not defensive, not arrogant, just honest. Small Blue Diamond fallout for the officers. By the end of the week, the Franklin County Police Department announced an internal investigation into both Sergeant Daniels and Officer Clark. Body cam footage from other officers at the scene revealed what many feared. Marcus was not resisting arrest. He was shoved into a wall when he asked, "Why are you arresting me?" The officers failed to report injuries, and both had intentionally left their body cams off against protocol. Daniels was suspended without pay pending further review. Clark was placed on administrative leave. Whispers of termination and criminal charges began circling local news. Judge Monroe never commented on it again. She didn't need to. Her courtroom had done what it was supposed to do: reveal the truth, expose abuse, and protect the innocent. It had been 2 weeks since that unforgettable morning in Judge Keisha Monroe's courtroom. The day she stood up to 2 disrespectful officers and flipped a silent injustice into a nationwide movement. The firestorm that followed had cooled slightly, but the impact? It was just beginning. Judge Monroe returned to the bench the following Monday. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Protesters stood on both sides of the street, some holding signs that read, "Thank you, Judge Monroe," others with banners saying, "Defend the Blue." But inside the courtroom, there was no yelling, no drama, no disrespect. The officers who entered now did so with straight backs and sealed lips. Attorneys sat taller. The audience watched every word spoken, because now they all understood this judge wasn't just holding court. She was holding a mirror up to a broken system, and the reflection couldn't be ignored. Small Blue Diamond, the case that sparked a movement. Marcus Hill's case was officially dismissed after the DA's office reviewed body cam footage, statements, and the internal investigation report. The injuries he suffered, the silence around them, and the blatant lies in the arrest report were enough to not only drop charges, but open a larger inquiry into similar misconduct. 10 other arrest reports by Sergeant Daniels were pulled for review. 3 had matching patterns: undocumented use of force, missing footage, and vague language like subject was non-compliant. Civil rights lawyers stepped in. New lawsuits were filed. And for the first time in Franklin County history, a public hearing was held about police behavior in juvenile arrests, triggered entirely by what happened in Judge Monroe's courtroom. The teenage boy whose voice was nearly silenced had become the voice of movement. Small Blue Diamond, the legacy of a bold decision. It wasn't just legal change. It was cultural. At law schools across the country, Monroe's video became case study material. Professors showed it in lectures about courtroom ethics, race and justice, and the boundaries of judicial authority. She was invited to speak at Howard University, her alma mater. During the Q&A, a law student stood up and asked, "Judge Monroe, weren't you afraid?" She paused for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said, "I was, but not for my job. I was afraid for what would happen if I said nothing. If I let that disrespect slide, I'd be telling every person watching that courtroom, especially every black child, that their dignity doesn't matter. That silence is safer than truth." And I couldn't do that. The auditorium erupted in applause. Small Blue Diamond, what happened to the officers? The fallout was swift and clear. Sergeant Daniels resigned after receiving notice of a formal disciplinary hearing that could lead to termination and possible criminal charges. Officer Clark was reassigned to administrative duties and placed under review, but eventually transferred to another department out of state. Public pressure and internal discomfort made it impossible for him to remain. Some called it cancel culture. Others called it long overdue justice. But for Judge Monroe, it wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring balance and setting a standard. Small Blue Diamond, a national voice for justice. Within a month, Judge Monroe was invited to Washington, D.C. to speak on a panel about police reform and judicial leadership. Sitting beside senators, civil rights advocates, and legal scholars, she spoke softly, but with unmistakable power. "What happened in my courtroom wasn't unique," she said. "What was unique is that it was recorded. A judge must not only uphold the law, she must reflect the values behind it. Dignity, equality, respect. When we allow even the smallest breach of that respect in court, we allow the erosion of justice itself." Her speech was covered in national newspapers and quoted in editorials across the country. People began calling her the people's judge. Young lawyers posted her quotes as inspiration. And black girls in high schools and law programs everywhere began to say, "I want to be like her." Small Blue Diamond back at home, she stayed the same. Despite her rising profile, Judge Monroe never stopped showing up to court on time, black robe pressed, and coffee in hand. She still signed warrants, still handled domestic cases, still listened carefully to both sides, asked tough questions, and handed out fair rulings. She hadn't changed, but everything around her had. Even the atmosphere in the courtroom felt different, tighter, more aware, more respectful. Not out of fear, but out of recognition that justice lived in that room, and it had a face. It was no longer just a concept. It was Judge Keisha Monroe, firm, fair, and unshakable. Small Blue Diamond, the final word. A few months later, Monroe sat down for a rare, in-depth interview. The journalist asked her, "Do you think one moment in a courtroom can really change anything?" She smiled. "No, not by itself," she replied. "But one moment can wake people up. It can remind them that justice isn't passive, it's active. And when we stand up for it, loudly or quietly, we give others permission to do the same." Then she leaned in just slightly. "The law is only as strong as the people who defend it, and I plan to keep defending it with everything I've got." The interview aired to over 10 million viewers. But Judge Monroe didn't watch it. She had another full day of court the next morning. Because for her, justice wasn't trend. It was her job, her calling, and she had no plans of stepping down.